Good afternoon. I'm George Chrisman. We're here at the German Orphan Home to interview Harry Kriemelmeyer. Harry's been on the board for since 1972, 73, somewhere in that time frame. And he was president off and on 5 or 6 times at least, if not more. We're also here with Louise Grass and Marge Curry. Louise Grass, of course, who is still on the board and whose husband was on the board for many years. And so now, why don't we just turn it over to Harry and see what we can get from him.
I guess I'm now being recorded for posterity. Good morning. I'm Harry Kriemelmeyer, Jr., and I believe I joined the board in 1972. It was an interesting progression to the board. I started out when I was about 5 months old at a German orphan home function on Good Hope Road. I have a picture in Mom's photo album. I was in a carriage all wrapped in whatever babies were wrapped in at that time, but my paternal grandfather and my family attended, I guess, one of the orphan home functions in 1931 and took some pictures. I guess there was a period of time that I didn't know an awful lot about the board. I certainly didn't learn much in 1931. But I do know that one side of my family, the Krautwurst side, were very close and supportive of a young lady at the home whose name I couldn't think of this weekend. She lives out in Iowa. But she was about the same age as my youngest aunt on that side of the family. So I did over time go to some of the orphan home functions, including when my grandfather wanted to drink beer and I could drive. And I snuck a beer or two in, I guess. In 1972, I got a pleasant luncheon invitation from Marge Curry. Would I meet them over at the Lido restaurant near the university? Well, I had gotten to know Marge from working with her husband Doug in the Apollo 11 activity that the University of Maryland was very heavily involved in. And so I said, that's a pleasant invitation, pleasant people. After all, we had supped wine on the banks of the canal down at Cape Kennedy for the Apollo, I guess, 8 or 9 launch.
That's right. And
we were down there for the Apollo 11 launch, so we had gotten to know each other pretty well, so I said yes. Turns out at the luncheon we have Marge, we have Doug, and we also have Olga Schwenk. And it seems that I'm the candidate in their mind, and they're doing a vetting on me to see if I should be allowed to join the board. As it was explained to me at the time, Olga and Marge and other board members wanted some, let's say, new thinking on the board. Maybe some new dynamism. They certainly didn't find it here, but anyway, new thinking, maybe they did. And I guess I had a final interview with with Olga, standing in the hot sun outside of the orphan home here in fall of 1972 at one of the Oktoberfests. And apparently the vetting worked out because I was asked if I would join the board and did. What I found was that at that time we had an unstable program within the orphan home. We were coming more and more away from the traditional charge of taking care, self-imposed charge of taking care of children who had had some upset in their family. Historically, the orphan home started because in-laws of a demised senior family member couldn't afford to take care of children who might be orphaned. And so the orphan home came about in 1879 to attempt to fill this gap. Social service as a fabric didn't really exist then. So this was one of the early, very early examples of an ethnic community, that is the Germans, coming together to help the children of families who, for one reason or another, may have demised. That began changing after Social Security. This is my opinion anyway. That began changing after Social Security came in, because a kid of parents who were under Social Security now had a federal care stipend that made them much more acceptable to other relatives to take care of, to raise, to bring up, and to treat like their own children. That changed, by its nature, that changed the fabric of our program here, slowly over the period of years of the 40s and 50s and 60s. As we reached, as I understand it, near the end of the 60s, we became much more of a professional program, and we're accepting kids who are referrals from the State Department of Social Services and, to some extent, the State Department of Juvenile Services. Social services would be where the family fabric is broken down. Juvenile services would be where there has been some element of misbehavior on the part of the child. That changed the complexity of our population. One of the things that we had to always be mindful of was that we didn't have an on-site school. We had to accept kids who could function in this setting and who could function in public school. And that made the selectivity process, and here I don't mean racially, but rather behaviorally, a much more exacting process that we had to trust the professionals now employed at the home. About the time, or soon after I came on the board in 1972, the state of Maryland legislature got into it and promulgated some new methods of funding for placements such as we had in the home. And while they funded these placements at a higher level of monthly stipend, they also had a notch effect. As I saw what was happening, if I can describe the notch effect kind of at the lowest and the least expensive level being foster parentage, the next level up would be a group home like we are, and then beyond us would be group programs with residential on-site training and, if you will, forced residence at the site like an Edgemead program. Or beyond that would then be the different state incarceration programs for juveniles. We were down at this bottom level, or next to the bottom level of a group home. And if I remember some of the monies of the time, our stipends were $550 a month, whereas a foster parentage might be $200. As you move further to the side of this chain towards the incarceration programs of the state, the cost may be approaching $2,000 per month per kid. So we were near the bottom level, and while the state appropriated some funds, they did not appropriate enough funds to fill the new stipends that had been approved. So we saw then a shifting, what I call the notching effect, a shifting from the programs like Edgemead, residential programs, down to us. Now that immediately meant that we were now being offered placements of children who were much more difficult and somewhat different than the typical child we had been able to bring into the program earlier. That had a profound effect on the stability of this program, because the children cost more. We needed more social workers. The Code of Maryland regulations decreed what kind of staffing we had to have. The Fair Labor and Standards Act decreed how we had to pay these people. And the typical, let's say, mom and pop type of arrangement no longer would suffice. We had to have staff with professional training and certain credentials. And as I saw the program in the mid-70s changing, it became one of where do we find the money to keep it going. While the orphan home has reasonable endowments, part of that is a lot in southeast Washington on which there's a high-rise built, and it brings in a certain amount of money per month. Other investments we have are the capital cost of this home, the capital cost of the 68 acres it sits on. And none of these are able to be clipped for an extra $5,000 a month, for instance. They are what they are, and that's the max you get out of them. We had some endowments that came in from different wills as they were probated over time. Many of those were helpfully driven by Mr. Grass, Bill, and other members of the board, Carl Schmuck, as they advised the German community, remember us in your will. These seem to also be, if you will, ceasing to flow very much in the mid to late 70s. One thing probably kept us alive as a program for the children we were getting, more than anything, interest rates went out the top window. They were running as high as 20% on our big CDs, as opposed to now if you write the same thing you may get 4%. That gave us a bit more income at a time we drastically needed, but nonetheless, we had two kinds of things that occurred at board meetings almost every month when we filled this room with 16 to 18 people and worked until 11 o'clock at night. The issues were the kind of kids and the shape of our program for the future, and where do we get the money. Through our wonderful current executive director, Marge Curry, she also being a pedigreed, a certificated social worker.
Right, right.
Marge also acted for a period of time as the director of the home, although she disdained that she wanted that as a permanent job.
Well, to interrupt you a minute, I came here in 1971, and I was the social worker hired to come in compliance with the KOMAR rule that had just been passed by the state legislature, which required that in any organization that there must be a certified social worker. And I remember very clearly being interviewed by all the old board members. It quickly passed by. But I wanted to mention that one of the things that occurred, as you said, with the Social Security system, is that by the time 1970 came by, and they were in this home was just 3 years old. By 1970 or 71, when I came here, there were only 12 children living in this large institution.
The home was built for 40.
And that became the problem, because social services, the board was looking to have placements, but there were no placements from parents, because parents were going to social services, and social services was placing the children in certified group homes. And so that was the reason that they agreed to hire me.
One of the things when you run a program, the overhead of that program, and if you don't mind, Marge, I'll call you part of the overhead.
Right.
The director of the program, the cook, the counselors, all of these are overhead. And if the support derives from the children that are within the home, and you have a restriction for whatever cause on how many children you can have here, but KOMAR mandates that you have certain parts of staffing, then the overhead stays high, and that was really what was giving us a serious crimp.
We also had the problem, you have to allow so much space per child. Do you remember that? The space and around the bed and everything. They really made it very difficult for the board to operate at that time. And another thing, we never had any black children in the home until the state got involved, and these black children were not well-trained children. They literally tore the house apart. The drapes were torn, everything, all the equipment was damaged. Isn't that right? Do you recall all that?
Well, I think that was more,
Was that later on?
that was in the 1975s,
Oh.
1975. And I think it was just the type of child rather than the race of the child
Mhm.
who was placed in the home.
I think it was, I agree with Marge, I think it was a much different problem than simply race. It was the type of child, the behavioral aspects of the child
Yes, that's right.
that couldn't function properly in a more open setting such as we
Yeah.
have here. The child needed a more highly constrained setting, such as an Edgemead. Edgemead still in
It
existence?
still is.
Good, okay.
What's Edgemead?
Edgemead is this middle program,
It's a residential.
the residential, schooling, residential, I'll use the word captivity because I can't think of the right word for it,
Boarding.
boarding, but certainly not incarceration like a prison. As I read a plaque on a barometer that was given to me when I ceased being president, I was president from 1976 through 1980. And if I remember then, approximately again 82 to 87. And
Was bad.
one of the things that we had to do since Marge disdained staying on as the director of the program.
But you know, to stop you for a minute, remember when we tried, in 1973, I think, we tried very hard to have people from different organizations come here to help us decide what to do. Do you remember that?
It was much later than that.
Oh, it was later than that?
Much later than that. I'll get to that.
Oh, okay, I thought it was early on.
No, it was when we reached the decision that the program couldn't continue as it was in about 1978 or 9.
Oh, I see.
And I'll go into that. I made some notes on it. In 1975, we had I guess, a fairly wide national search for a new director. And out of it, we did some interviewing and hired, as I remember, a guy named John Bashinsky. Bashinsky had good references and good credentials. The board, no longer in the business of darning socks and hopefully no longer in the business of trying to micromanage the director, allowed the director to report to the board his progress and his problems each month, but largely gave him a free hand. Mr. Bashinsky hired a guy named Boxley. I can't remember Boxley's first name, as Boxley was to be the recreational program assistant. In a period of time, and not very long period of time, it turned out that the real leadership and dynamic motion, decision-making process was no longer done by Bashinsky, but rather by Boxley. The board resisted this rather significantly. Superimposed on this is this syndrome of the notch effect, shifting kids to us that are more difficult than our program here could handle and public schools could handle. So as time went on, we saw more and more difficult kids coming into the house, and the board had to, I think, restrain some of these admissions. There came a time when Bashinsky and Boxley went to the media and said, we're going to have a press conference at the German orphan home and talk about their racism and their selectivity and their efforts to not give fair treatment to all children and not provide a program where all children can function properly and so forth and so on. The board was invited to this press conference, of course, in our own facility. And this was kind of a seminal act on their part that I took very seriously. I happened to find out, doing a little bit of research, that Mr. Boxley had a felony warrant issued for him. And I informed the board of this press conference and then asked the majority of the board to stay away. So we would not have a voting majority or a voting quorum at that press conference. The press conference took place. Soon thereafter, the state police arrived and arrested Mr. Boxley, and we've never seen him since. The board had a statement to make at the press conference that was a denial of what they were saying. And I guess the next act, although I'm not sure exactly how soon, the next act was I fired Boxley and Bashinsky and asked Frank Scrogg to become acting director while we decided what to do. And Marge was still working with us, so we had really good backup. She was not a board member by that time, at that time, although soon thereafter I think she became a board member. This was a critical move, and it was really the seminal event that started our program closing down. We could no longer afford it. We could no longer properly care for the kind of children that were being referred within the state system. And there was a general, I think, attitude on the part of state social workers that group homes are not the thing they wanted to be working towards or working with. They wanted to reach the end of the line, the foster care, more so than group homes. So we were in the middle of a strangling contest where we were sort of strangling ourselves, really.
Certainly, group homes for little children was developmentally inappropriate. And that's what the German orphan home was used to having, little children to grow up here.
To spend
their lives here.
Growing up time.
The growing up years here. And really, group homes, they were considered okay for the more difficult teenager.
After the press conference and some of the shell shocks that rebounded within the board and within the community and within the state, the board decided to freeze entry voluntarily, to say we want no more referrals. We're going to work with our program, you work with your side, and we're going to freeze entry. It was astounding to me how long a claim of discrimination would take to make it through HEW or take to make it through Prince George's County. HEW sat on this thing for a couple of years. During this entire time, we were essentially freezing our admissions, so our program was attritioning down to where it became like 10 children again, more or less. It had reached, I think, as high as 25 or 28 in some of the early 70s and mid-70s.
Under Mike.
Under Mike Stern. The HEW finally got off the dime when I called a congressman and asked him to intervene with them. And they finally made a pronouncement that they could find no evidence of any discrimination on the part of the German Orphan Home Board or program. We had another one in Prince George's County that I guess Bashinsky bought when he was fired, that this was an illegal termination and it was discriminatory. So we went through the bouncing around with Prince George's County, and they finally found that he was, I forget the word, I keep thinking negligence, but that's not it, but grossly negligent behavior, something like that, in calling the press conference to start with and trying to have this showdown with the Orphan Home Board when the board employed him and the board owned the premises in which he called the press conference. And so they dismissed those charges against us. It is in this setting, that the board put together a special study committee of what should be the future program for the German Orphan Home, given that we have the facility, given that we have the state fabric of laws we're working with, given that we have a restraint on our income because, as I said, the investments can't be clipped off for just a little bit of money each month without saying we're starting down the death path, which no one on the board wanted to do. We convened a special committee chaired by a board member, Fred Wineland, who at that time was Secretary of State, and had on the board Judge Alfred Noyes of Montgomery County, a juvenile judge of great respect out there, Rex Smith, who was head of the Department of Juvenile Services, the Dean of Social Work at UMAB, Ruth Young. Couldn't think of her last name. And maybe a couple of others who looked at the home. They spent some time on this. This was not a telephone consultancy. They came, they looked, they walked. Most of them knew the state and knew the state's systems, and they recommended to us that we transform the program of the home into 30-day crisis care. That is, young adults or children who are picked up under some problem needed some place to go while the issues cooled down and got sorted out, and so they recommended crisis care to us. The board decided that they did not want to get into 30-day crisis care. The board had always had a high identification, or at least some of the board members, high identification with the children in our care. And they felt this would be too dramatic a change. While there might be a need for crisis care, the board did not see that that was the future of the home. So therefore, in 1979, we had the bittersweet situation of celebrating our 100th anniversary. At the same time, we made a decision to close down the program of the home. We had a celebration, if you will, of the 100th anniversary, attended by Mrs. Hughes, the wife of the governor, and George just showed me earlier some pictures taken of that, and was an interesting affair, and I certainly enjoyed it. But we had already decided to close down the home. The question then came, what do we do? Well, first of all, we had to phase out in a decent way the children in the home to make sure they had some place to go or had reached graduation or things of that sort. And I think that took us until 1980 to do that. Soon thereafter, the home was, of course, then vacant. We had Mike Stern as the director after the interim actions of Frank Stroh. And Mike did as good a job as very well possible in trying to keep the program going, and most of all to make sure no harm came to the children. I'm pleased Mike is currently a board member. Once we closed the program in 1980, I was approached by another board member, Bill Amonette, who was councilman in Prince George's County, also for some time in their chair of the county council, and with a request that we try and work with a group named Assisi. Assisi was a battered women's program that had an outgrowth from the House of Ruth in Washington. And what's her name? Fisher. Came with the director. What's Fisher's first name? I'm sorry, I forget right now. We, as an interim, Assisi having no money and the home having no occupant, we agreed to allow Assisi for a period of time, not more than a year, to make use of the home without paying any rent to us, and make use of the property, the furnishings, and so forth. Assisi had internal conflicts of a significant kind. They were battered, battered's the wrong word, it was a battered women's program, but they were torn between the Women's Commission of Prince George's County and another clique, and in between was the Assisi program, and it just didn't and couldn't stabilize, even though they had free being here. So they closed down, and at that time, I think either I was contacted or Marge or somebody was contacted about Second Genesis, who came to the table with money, who came to the table with what we could find out is a highly respected program, who came to the table with a severe problem, having been housed in an old flea trap hotel out on Route 301.
I do remember that.
We went there and had a
Oh,
meeting.
yeah.
Do you remember that?
Oh, it's,
All of us were pretty pleased with meeting the directing and formative personnel of Second Genesis, and we did sit down with the assistance of Warren Krug and a few others and negotiate a lease for them in 5-year increments, which is still in effect today. And Second Genesis has been, I think, an ivory soap occupant of our facility here. Probably, we might find 66 100ths of 1% to complain about, but the bulk of what they do
Agreed.
is really good.
there was that psychiatrist in the interim, the one to rent the building. You remember him?
No.
It was, you and I met him here, and he brought someone with him.
Oh, he was from a church up the road here.
He was a psychiatrist?
Yeah, he was a psychiatrist, but he was connected with a church up the road, and we decided we'd stay out of that.
Yeah.
The other one we looked to was Melwood.
Melwood.
The Melwood program,
Yeah.
which is for mentally and physically handicapped, generally speaking, young adults, not smaller children. And Melwood has a stellar program and wanted to make use of the beginning of their own residency program, make use of the home towards that program. The discussions with them never went as far as they did with Second Genesis, because I think Second Genesis appeared to us to bring more competency and more reliability of paying rent, et cetera, to the table. Although the Melwood program is and has been and continues to be a very good program. I don't mean to criticize it in any way, but from our business aspect, Second Genesis seemed to be a better choice.
And don't forget the German group, or Swiss, was it Swiss, that they brought over, and they were down, didn't come to us. They turned us down.
Oh, Olga was involved.
August, yes.
Um,
And now they're way up in Maryland. Your butter, Pete, was very fond of
Salem.
Salem House.
Yeah, Salem was located in, I guess, Culver County for a while.
Originally.
Original.
They have a very successful program up in Grantsville, Maryland, which is just west of Frostburg, and have a strong religious focus, but nonetheless bring in children from referrals up there, and a very large and successful program of house parenting. Salem chose to build small houses, possibly of 8 residents each, and have a couple operate the house as, if you will, a mom and pop of these 8. They've had to change that considerably because they have, in recent years, they have had to adhere to work regulations that are different than a married couple would have in the past had to work to. So they now had to recompartment some of these houses at the same time to build more. I receive their newsletters. We make contributions personally, and I know the board makes contributions to them from time to time. As we negotiated the Second Genesis lease, and we knew we were committed to closing down the program, we wanted to look at what do we do with the assets of the program.
You're really organized.
Yeah.
We were talking about assets. We now found ourselves as a board 101 years old, a program 100 years old, that had been closed. We now had productive use of this facility, including rent being paid. We had other income lines and investments as well as ownership of the property. So the board had its next decision of what do we do? Marge Curry about us becoming a funding foundation. Our legal advisor of many, many years, Irving Yokelson, was no longer around to help us. And I forget the gentleman's name.
Binstock.
Harvey Binstock. Harvey Binstock worked with Marge, with me, and various others, and we adopted a format of becoming the German Orphan Home Foundation. This is more a paper name than a true name because we made the conscious decision to not change our congressional charter that dated back, I think, to 1912. And it's a congressional charter as a corporation in the District of Columbia. So we formed the German Orphan Home Association as a subcomponent of the German Orphan Home Incorporated under our charter, and began a program with a grants committee of seeking to distribute the income which came to the board each year into other programs that typically would focus on the needs of youth in the community and would themselves be 501c3 type corporations or type programs, that is charitable in nature. And Marge did a great deal of the organizational work, the criteria for consideration, and we launched into this program then of giving away in small grants of between $1,000 and maybe $8,000 or $9,000 max, something in the neighborhood of greater than $100,000 in most years. It has been well received, I think well used by most of the recipients. One of the things that Marge had proposed and the board accepted, that these not be repetitive grants, that these only be used as an increment of improvement type of grant that would not be expected to be repeated each year to keep a certain staff member on, for instance. And we've pretty well largely adhered to that. We've given, I guess, repetitive grants only to a group that was represented to the board by our board member Henry Lutterlow to take in-town children fishing each summer. And we gave a grant to that repetitively, but I can't think of any others where we did that.
I should mention, Harry, that when we were thinking about the foundation status, Bill Grass and Carl Knobloch were very involved in it. And Carl went to see the heads of several foundations, and I went with him. And Mr. Grass went to see, he and I went to see the head of the Meyer Foundation, which is the Washington Post. We had a very nice discussion with the head of the Meyer Foundation.
I'm glad you added that because I didn't really have visibility of those. That brings me to kind of the last two topics I wanted to cover in this semi-monologue before we open it up and get everybody around the table communicating. One is Melwood Hall, which is now called Knobloch Hall. This was built before I got here in two stages, largely financed by the Washington Sanger Bond, but on German Orphan Home property and covered by an agreement between the board and the Sanger Bond dated, I think, around 1970. The Melwood Hall was used and managed as a fundraising activity, principally by the Sanger Bond, and subset almost exclusively by our board member Carl Knobloch, operating on behalf of the Sanger Bond. The Sanger Bond did give a yearly gift to the German Orphan Home based largely on the proceeds of their Oktoberfest. most years, the expenses of operating Melwood, its maintenance, its fuel, etc., exceeded the income that the board got in. So it was not a money-raising venture. It was rather a small loss that was incurred each year. The Sangerbund was very protective of it because they had the investment of both labor and love and money in it. And I, as president, saw no particular problem with that. But I didn't want to enhance, I think, their ownership by striking a new agreement. I preferred to let the old one live its due course because it had a phase-down type of clause in it. I didn't want to get into a major knockdown with the Sangerbund because that would fragment whatever German support maybe both of us had. And so we let things continue on as, in fact, they're going on today. Many ideas came up about what can we ultimately do with that hall. We researched the zoning of that hall and found it to be a recreation hall for the children of the German orphan home. We did not want to go back and ask for a change in that zoning or the special exception by which it was built. It occurred at a time when that was a logical and legitimate thing to ask for. We felt that to try and make use of it, for instance, to turn it over as a casino 4 or 5 nights a week, which became legal in Prince George's County, would not be the kind of thing we want going on right up the street from the Second Genesis program here. So we kept the status of Melwood like it is. The board and the Sangerbund are still on reasonable terms, and we have some Sangerbund members who are members of our board. I don't know of any German orphan home board members who are otherwise involved in the Sangerbund board as a counterpart to their presence in our board. This interlocking worried Carl Knobloch very much. Carl was a man of great depth that didn't always show, but he raised sophisticated arguments about our 501c3, ranking by the Internal Revenue Service, the interlocking directorships between the Sangerbund and the German orphan home. And through this process, we saw just how deep Carl was really thinking and how much he loved the orphan home activity and board. That moves me over to my, I guess, ending observations about how important the orphan home board was. Bill Grass was absolutely a cornerstone. Olga Schwenk, absolutely a cornerstone. George Chrisman, absolutely a cornerstone. Bill Caldwell, who originated, I think, from the Sangerbund, but has been a member of the board of the orphan home ever since about the time I started, I think has been a real contributor to the orphan home program too. There are many others, some of whom I've probably forgotten, and some of whom I would wish to forget. But but nonetheless, I think the fact that we're still in existence at 1997, some 118 years after our founding, still solvent and still carrying out to the extent possible our original mission of that time, I think speaks well for the board over the years. Having said that, Mr. President, Mr. Maneuverer of the camera, I'd like to open it up now for a little bit of cross-table discussion.
I think one of the most difficult things with Melwood Hall being up there, the now Knobloch Hall, when many of us were working here, is that we had teenagers who needed to be in some kind of activity, especially in the winter time. And I think every administrator was very concerned that the children were never allowed to play up at Knobloch Hall, when indeed most people knew that this was the reason that it was built. And I think that made it very difficult because there was no place here for them to actually play.
I think you're very right.
And I think that should be said, because I think that was difficult.
I want to go back. Was Larry Ozer on the board when you came on? I don't
No.
recall.
No, I took Larry Ozer's place on the board.
Oh, you did? Oh, because Larry Ozer, he was a good worker, but he was a thorn in many people's side.
Well, I've heard that, and of course I heard that very deeply and strongly from Carl Knobloch when we interviewed him.
Oh, yes, you would.
He had rather strong feelings about Larry Ozer.
And interestingly enough, as I've read the minutes reflect all of those feelings about Mr. Ozier.
Yes, he was.
Well, toward the end, one of his problems was he was suffering from a brain tumor, which he actually
Yeah.
died from.
Apparently.
And I think this reflected on his thinking and actions quite a bit.
One of the things that I didn't mention in my earlier discussion was the burden that the architecture of this particular home gave the program over the years once it moved here. It's an extremely open setting, and it is one that defies control if you have a group of children who need control. There is no opportune place to put a midnight person to sit and control both wings, because they're greatly separated, and there's two stairways or two levels in between. The home, as I understand it, before my time, but the architecture of the home was proposed by Pop Chrisman on, I think, valid grounds. Nonetheless, the board wrote it through and proceeded with this home of the two wings, of large plate glass windows, of the lack of ability to control a changing population. And I think that had some effect, really, on the way we had to staff the home. It had some effect on the expenses of operating it. It had some effect on the security of the children in it.
It had a fatal effect on the future of the home, because we went from a group home, basically, in Southeast, to an institution when society was moving away from institutions to a group home. And the German group home in Catonsville, which was also founded by the same minister who founded our organization.
Well, that was from Concordia
It's
Church.
that is still operating. But they put cottages on their land early on, and they have kept the cottages.
Much as we said, Solomon in Grantsville has
Exactly.
a cottage plan and is surviving reasonably well.
Mhm.
Yeah, the architect for this
Exactly.
building was Leon Chatterlane,
Oh, yeah.
who was an extremely well-known and noted architect. I don't know who
Well, I
got him.
Well, I got him probably because he was Swiss
Uh-huh.
descent. Willie was
Yeah.
Swiss,
But
German.
as Harry was saying, when Pop saw the plans, he said, "No way." That's when Pop retired.
Oh,
He said, "There's no way you can administer that building with the program that we have now."
I thought it was that your father wanted saw the lay of the land and wanted it this way. I didn't know it was Chatelaine that designed it.
No, he said there was no way he could administer
Oh,
the program in this building.
yeah.
In essence, it became an institution rather than a group
Oh,
home.
yes.
That's really what happened.
Well, you had two wings, each, I guess, set for, in smaller bedrooms or in the dormitory in each wing, set for approximately 20 people on each side. And you had the counselors or the staff living in apartments in this center wing. You'll have to take a picture of the home from that side so this will make more sense. But they closed their door at night and went away, and the kids were left largely to themselves. And if you had somebody do a night watch, you'd have to pay them. And we were having money troubles, and so that became an impractical solution. So there were, in the decision to shut down the home, it was neither an easy nor a simple one, but there were many causative factors that led us to terminate the program.
I would like to say a word about Harry. Harry took on the board. I was rooting for him to become president way back then, and I guess that's why we're friends today. I don't know.
It's your fault that I never knew that.
But Harry took on this board and really was a godsend to the orphan home, because he got us on our feet and thinking, and he had such awful difficult problems to contend with. And the board owes him a great deal of thanks.
Well,
I
thank
agree.
you, Louise.
I agree.
Yeah.
The board, let me generalize this, a board of Germans tends to elect somebody to be their leader, and they will follow them over the edge of a cliff. So one has to be very careful about the, let's say, the power of being president of a board of Germans. One way to avoid that was to diversify the board, which I think in the 70s we tended to do. And as well, some of the board members who had been the cornerstones in the 50s, excluding Bill, who was a cornerstone in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and Carl Knobloch almost as long. Many of these gentlemen had to move off the board, leaving openings, and so we were able to diversify and, if you will, bring in a new train of thought. Bill Caldwell, some of the new members of the board are outstanding in their own right. They bring professional cloth to the board, and while we didn't ask them to be the board's accountant, for instance, they have been very wise in their advice to us over the years, and many other examples. So I think we have a strong board. We do not have an awful lot of board matters other than the grants committee, and an occasional question comes up concerning our capital assets or this building, but mostly it is how do you adjudicate the grants program and make the awards.
Do you think that this board will remain interested because there is so little to do?
I would slowly rotate the people on the grants committee so that everybody has a taste of it.
I think every board member should serve on the grants committee. It's very enlightening, and you really become aware of the needs of children in the whole area. And
Well taken.
No, I think
I think I'll bring this point up at the annual meeting, if that's the place to do it. Because I certainly have gotten a lot of knowledge by serving on the grants committee.
I would say if you have a 3-year or 4-year expectation to be on the grants committee, where the first year or two you're in a learning status, and the last year or two you're in a more leadership and decisional recommendation status. And I think by doing that, you can have the board, over a period of time, get involved in what is now our most important activity. Many years ago, the activities tended to center on darning socks and raising money for college scholarships and music lessons and things like that, if we go back into the 40s and 50s, and things are just wholly different now. The Grants Committee is our outreach program, and it's a very important one.
Say a few words about the mission as indicated in the Articles of Incorporation and how we're continuing to follow that mission.
Well, I just bet you've read that more recently than I have, so I'm going to let you do it.
I haven't read it that recently, but But I think that we continue to follow in giving the grants exactly what the original mission was.
Well, we had, of course, the mission of 1879, which was to provide care for children who otherwise had no method of receiving a decent living, decent standard of living, protected care, and upbringing. That's not what it says, I realize.
Basically, it does say that.
But we were focusing on children from, not exactly infants, but preschool all the way up through high school. And when you graduated high school, that night you had your suitcase packed and you were out the door.
That was very difficult time.
That was difficult.
And the Baptist Club tried to help them. And I forget the man's name. He was on the board. He was a stamp collector. And he and his wife would take one of the girls.
Lucy.
Lucy.
Kurt Lucy.
Yes. And he did that. And I don't know whether there were more.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, go ahead, George.
No, that's all right. No, I was just bringing up the guy's name.
Well, we tried to get them in college, help them to go
Yeah.
through college. Who gave the grants for the college?
A committee of Mr. Sentman,
Yeah.
and I think Bill, and someone else. I think by the time I got here in 1971, almost all the students who were in college
Yeah.
were already set.
Yeah.
And I think from that point forward, we didn't do much with that.
Well, Carl Schmidt, we got through college.
Right, he was before me, interesting.
Oh, he was?
They were all before me.
Oh.
They were like in their second or third year of college by the time I got here. And then after that, what we did with that college fund is we did fund a few students who were going into apprenticeships.
Mm-hmm.
The board somewhere in the very late or middle 60s, I guess, brought their first woman on board, Olga Schwenk. The impact of that statement is that before that time, and even after that time, there were two general groups. If you were a male, you were a board member, and if you were a wife, you were part of the Happiness Club or the Women's Committee of the home. And you had certain things that you were to do, and both of these groups were both large, well-founded, well-run, and gave great benefits to the program of the home. We now have a few more women on the board, I think.
Yes.
And I suppose you should mention that Olga Schwenk is the one who integrated this board as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
With Henry
Henry
Lutterlow
Lutterlow, yeah.
And
Chin.
Mr. Chin.
If I look at the vision people who were on the board, Olga and Bill Grass would be way up high.
Definitely.
well, they got to say something about Carl Schmidt. He was very good.
Early on, I
Yeah.
think. He was certainly very good.
Mm-hmm.
He was certainly a leader.
What else comes to mind?
Bill Weitzel.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was Bill Weitzel's background?
He was fire chief.
Deputy
Yeah.
fire chief or fire chief?
Fire chief or deputy fire
He was
chief
up
in Washington
next-
D.C.
Yeah.
And he was on the board for a long time.
Yeah.
He was also well-to-do. And I
Yeah,
often
very
wonder
well to do.
where the devil he got
Where?
his money, because the fire department didn't pay those kind of wages.
Well, you see, they have a plumbing company here in Southeast Washington.
Oh, okay.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yes, and his uncle left him a sizable amount of money for what
Oh,
it was.
okay.
And then who was the fellow from Acacia who was on the board? And then we had some board members who were raised at the home.
Oh, Monroe.
Yeah.
Take your
Leslie
choice.
No, he
Monroe.
wasn't raised, his wife was.
No, his wife was raised at the home.
Take your
Yeah.
choice. I've just handed Louise the board picture of 1969,
Oh,
which
yeah.
comes complete with names and faces.
Well, I know Willie got Ernie Reed. He had a coal company or something.
Oil.
Oil.
I still see his
Never-
trucks around.
And Harold Setman was in a
Columbia
savings
Federal.
savings and loan. And George Seidel was in construction. He's deceased. Fritz Hens, wasn't he raised at the home?
Yeah,
That's
he was
right.
raised.
was
Yeah.
raised.
Irving Yokelson and Ozer and Monroe, his Weitzel, and Bobby
He was
Dreschler.
raised at the home, too.
Yeah, but he was on the board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Harry Linden, now I don't know anything about Harry Linden. John Umhow, he was on for a long time.
He was on there, he was on the board when we came to the Washington in 1940, I think.
Oh, my God.
And Pop's got Curtis from Curtis
Oh.
Furniture on the board, because that's my husband. And Thomas Quinn.
Oh, wow.
He was a
on
car
the board
dealer.
when
He
I
owned
was
the
there.
Ford dealership.
He was also on the school board, I think, in PG County.
I think you're right.
And there's Kurt Luthi, who we mentioned. And Johnny Wimmel had a plumbing business. And Johnny Wimmel took some boys from the home and got them in the apprentice union, or in the union. And some are still plumbers, aren't
Right.
they?
Right.
I don't know whether they're still working for Johnny Wimmel
No.
or not.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Roberts.
Roberts, I'm sorry.
Eddie Roberts.
Eddie
Roberts, yeah.
Roberts, yeah. Now, do you want to know any more?
No, thank you. It's interesting how narrow, to some extent, the community is. I knew John Umhow from church. Charles Curtis I came across a few years ago when we became interveners against a power plant in Brandywine. He and his wife owned property right across the street. Johnny Wimmel used to be our family plumber.
Yeah.
Bobby Drexler, I didn't mention when sometime during the time I was president, somebody convinced me that we should rewrite or update our bylaws. And we had a committee, as I remember it, of Marge working with us, George Chrisman, Bobby Drexler, myself, and there may have been somebody else involved too. But we did rewrite the bylaws at that time. I think this is about mid-1970s, to update some of the passages that dealt more with the 20s.
Okay, this is a picture of the Board of Directors at the 75th anniversary of the German Orphan Home.
Act of Congress Charter.
Okay, we got, starting at the top there, we got Marty Wiegand, who had the
He was in the lumber business.
down on South Capitol Street.
Yeah. Marty, he used to contribute to the orphan home even after he retired from the board. And his secretary called up the house one day and asked about what type of organization we were, and it questioned my husband all about who was on the board. She was taking care that it wasn't a bogus organization and that it was going directly to the home, not to a collection agency.
And there's Rena Cavalier, remember Rena Cavalier?
Yes, He
Yeah.
was the past Grand Master of Masons in the district.
Yeah,
Is that the
And-
Cavalier in Buckley now?
No,
Yes.
he wasn't Cavalier in Buckley.
wasn't it?
No, but he was a lawyer. Like,
I think he was,
and then his nephew or somebody is the Dr. Cavalier. He's deceased
oh,
too.
okay. And then, now Frederick Bertram, I don't remember him.
Let me see his picture. I remember the name. No, I don't. No. Yeah, I remember his name. And I know this one. Giesler, Fred Giesler.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was a French chef, and his wife was very, very active in the women's group.
What was the restaurant they had over town?
I didn't
Did they-
think they had the red, no, that isn't the, no, that was the,
Okay.
God.
Of course, there's Umhow.
Yeah, John Umhow and who was the other one? They used to make the coffee. These men were something, making coffee at the old home for the Decoration and Labor Day fundraisers. Do you remember them?
Yeah,
And they put on their aprons?
yeah,
Yeah.
What was his background?
of course.
Umhow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a government employee. I
Umhow was a
know.
government employee. His son became a doctor. I
Yeah.
knew them both at Grace Lutheran Church in Washington.
Yeah.
And he questioned every damn thing at every board meeting. I mean, he
Yeah.
didn't spend a nickel without Umhow questioning it.
That's right.
He was a contributor to the 11 o'clock meetings.
Yeah,
Yeah. Right.
PM adjournment times.
And Henry
I do
Dietrich.
remember that.
Yeah, Henry Dietrich, he was a florist. No.
He was a
no,
florist, yeah.
Florist, yes, lived up on South Capitol Street at the top
right
of the
at the
hill.
corner of Nichols Avenue
Yeah.
and South Capitol.
And they were very generous to the
Oh, they
home.
were. And he would always slip the money in and try not to let anybody know he was giving.
Yeah,
You know, he'd give Pop a check, Pop would take it down, put it in, and try to keep it a secret. And who else was on? Oh, of course, Irving Yokelson,
yeah.
Leslie Monroe.
Was Irving a board member or was he consultant to the board?
He was evidently a board member.
Yeah.
Fine man.
Oh, Rudy Sandelman from over in,
He was staying in Salone.
yeah, they're about 3rd and Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes. And his brother was the conductor of the Marine Band.
Yeah.
William Miller, who was that?
William Miller. The Mrs. Miller was president of one of the women's group, and that was her son. And I think he was a government employee. I'm not sure.
And Carl Ochterkirchen.
Oh, remember, he was really a German, and he did the paintings. I don't think you call them a frieze on the dome, on the dome of the Capitol.
Yeah.
Uh-huh,
And on his home,
yeah.
you know, up around the chandelier in the living room, there was these roses and all painted. in the
Oh,
ceiling.
yes. And
Absolutely gorgeous.
his daughter, Dorothy, remember, she met, there was
Chief.
the chief, a Navy chief. I mentioned it, I think, when you interviewed me, and at the home, and she met the boy's father one day, and they eventually got married. And the son became a minister that was raised here at the home for a while.
Who's this? Slipper?
Slifer,
Slifer.
Yeah, he was, Carl, was it Carl? No.
Stephen.
Stephen Slifer. They wanted, or they did adopt 2 children from the orphan home. Do you remember
I
that?
don't remember that.
Yeah. He was an official on the Savings and Loan Board or something with the government. His wife is still living at my neighborhood. He was he was very young when he died.
He looked very young here compared to
Yes.
all the others.
It's
Yeah.
amazing how many people, of course, including Bill, were associated with banks and savings and loans.
Well, that's, I
on
guess
the
that
board.
German heard
Yeah.
to save.
Yeah.
Did you name them all?
Oh, I don't think I ran down the whole name. There's Edgar Brown.
Edgar Brown was in construction. Well, I got him on the board. He had Brown and Whittington, or Whittington and Brown was a construction company in Washington.
And Jacobson.
Irving Jacobson, isn't it?
No, CF.
Oh, he was president of one of the banks.
Yeah. He was the one, I think, Mom was kidding him one day about all the money he had, and he said, "You never know how long a snake is till it's dead."
Go ahead, Nate.
I don't know why I remember that.
Oh, there's
little thing.
Commander Rigdon.
Well, Bill Rigdon, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, he was real fond of Carl Schmidt. And I remember the daggone, your mother's dog.
Oh, that boxer.
Yeah, the boxer, great big boxer. And Gene Rigdon would get so mad when Bill would come home from the orphan home because the dog would always mess up his pants by licking him. So I think they made him an apron, put the split apron for him.
Didn't he write a book about the...
Yes,
Yeah.
the White House Sailor.
Yes,
White House.
Sailor in the White House.
Yeah,
or
something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Charles McGinnis, did I mention him? He was the optometrist down
Yeah.
in Anacostia,
Yeah. Mhm.
next to the savings and loan where
Yeah.
Carl was.
There are a lot of board members here.
Yeah.
More than 21, I think. How about Mr. Lurch?
Lurch, oh, yeah, well, I remember
Boy, there
Mr.
is.
Lurch.
Man, there's a slew of them here. I don't know.
I don't recall that.
You know, maybe they did take, well, it said board of directors.
It was Board
Did they change the number?
The number was, from what I can see in the history, the number went anywhere from 11 to 28 to whatever it is
Oh.
now. And apparently it's a free-flowing thing. You can have as many members on the board as you want to.
They got 28 here.
They have 28. That must have been the 28 year.
I know during the time I was president, and I guess since, it's been a conscious decision to always leave a couple of board seats empty. In the event there is some special skill because of a new or different problem where we wanted to bring somebody into the board to assist us with it. So we always kept a couple of seats empty.
He was very involved in the finances of it.
Yes, he was president or an officer for Anacostia's insurance company,
No, it was Acacia.
Acacia.
He was the chief financial officer for Acacia Mutual Insurance Company, I think.
And he's the one that was instrumental in getting Leslie Monroe on the board?
Yeah, because Leslie worked there.
Yes.
And then there was a couple other people from Acacia that were unhappy.
Johnny
as
Cobb.
well.
Johnny Cobb was on the board, and he worked at Acacia. Johnny Cobb was president of OBA, Oriental Building and Loan Association.
I'd like to address Irving Yokelson. During the time I was president, Irving was not a board member, but was still serving a role as legal advisor to the board. He was a member of the firm, as I remember it, of Fox, Yokelson, and Beta. I may have the names mixed up. But nonetheless, he was a cornerstone of giving us advice, and his fee always came to zero. So for many years, when we were involved in the controversies in the mid-70s, Irving was our advisor and a sound one, and had a fee of zip. Other person I'd like to mention is this gentleman here. It would not be news to say Christian Heinrich was a cornerstone of Washington. He was a brewer, made beer, and became quite wealthy doing so, and gave many gifts of money to the orphan home at the formative times in the late 18s and early 1900s. My grandfather used to always tell an interesting story about Mr. Heinrich. He said that the Germans every Sunday had a canal barge trip over in Georgetown. The C&O Canal was an operating canal up until 1922. So in the 19s, the barge trip occurred every Sunday afternoon, and it was always a German trip, and Christian Heinrich would give the beer. for the trip. So all the Germans on board the boat could have all the free beer they wanted until it ran out. Now, the difficulty came when some of the Germans had sufficient beer to fall over the back of the boat and nobody noticed them. So more than once they came back 1 or 2 Germans short of their trip. And he always smiled and said, "What a way to get children into the home."
Didn't he give money to the Rupert home too?
Yeah, I
He
think
gave
so.
more
Yeah.
money to the Rupert home than he did to the German orphan
Yeah.
home, and that was always a bone of contention.
And I should mention, or it should be mentioned now, that we have his Jen Evans's great-granddaughter, granddaughter, who is on the board, and she's head of the grants committee, and she has really done a wonderful job in her contributions to the home. And she's a delightful person, and I'm glad my husband got her on the board. He's got the whole Croatians on his board. Who was the other person you wanted to mention there?
No, Irving and
Oh.
Christian Heinrich. We're sitting in the room of the orphan home that has long been the office of the Orphan Home Board. Surrounding us is a program, the Second Genesis, which several years ago moved into the treatment of young women who have been involved in substance abuse with their children. So in an interesting way, we now have children running back and forth past the door as this tape was being made, much like in the many years ago. I don't know what the size of their population is, but it had been running last time I asked in the neighborhood of 30 or so women and possibly as many as 40 children with them. It seems to be a sound program working well, and we're pleased to have them here. The other thing is I asked the president, who has been our cameraman here, to go around and take some pictures outside the home. And we'll do that assuming rain hasn't occurred since we've been in here. And we'll do that at the end of this tape. I'd like to make a very brief wrap-up by saying that by no way are we out of the decision-making process. We have to keep our board strong. We have to keep them involved in our program of administration of grants to needy charities involving children in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. We also have to give an eye as to what do we do in the future. We've been aware of a parallel group of us called the Rupert Home, that as they lost the home, lost their program, went into basic hibernation, and we're not real sure where the assets of the Rupert Home ever made it to. Not that I'm accusing anything of being wrong, but I'm not aware that they're being applied to the social needs of the Washington area. The orphan home should continue to plan for the future. We're in a building that is now 30 years old. We're on 68 acres of land in somewhat rapidly developing Prince George's County. And there may come a time when the board has to decide what its future is as far as the property is concerned. We've examined it a little bit in the past and could not find clear signs of which way to go, so we stayed status quo. But I think that's a question that isn't over. It's going to loom before the board in the next number of years again. The president has appointed a strong committee to look at that, and it's an ongoing look to see what might be done. There is nothing at the